On June 13, a council of war gathered on board the HMS Diadem to define if the invasion would start in Buenos Aires or Montevideo. Bedford wanted to attack Montevideo because it would be easier to defend once captured, since it was a fortified city and had a deep water harbor. Popham, on the other hand, was determined to attack Buenos Aires. He affirmed that the city wasn't well defended and that since it was the capital, its capture would cause a domino effect and the viceroyalty would surrender to the invaders. Nevertheless, there was an economical reason behind his decision. The Commodore was aware of a cargo of Peruvian silver that has just arrived into the city and he intended to capture it. Finally, Popham imposed his wishes and it was decided that Buenos Aires was going to be the main target. On June 16, the British fleet split. The ships of the line started a blockade on Montevideo and the mouth of the River Plate. The rest of the ships, the one with the lower draft, started the approach to Buenos Aires. The Justina, one of the armed merchant vessels that has joined in Saint Helene, and the HMS Encounter were the leading vessels. Since the beginning, the British found that the River Plate was extremely complicated to navigate. There were 3 very important sandbanks, their navigation charts were outdated, and the water level in the river could drop very fast without notice. Many times, these dangers were close to cause the loss of ships during the voyage. The worst incident happened on June 22, when the HMS Narcissus got grounded on the Chico Bank and was nearly torn apart by a thunderstorm. Even with the help of the Scot William Russell, that knew the area well, 11 days were needed to travel the 100 kilometers to Buenos Aires. Finally, on June 24, the fleet anchored on Quilmes Bay. While the British were getting closer to Buenos Aires, Sobremonte kept denying the possibility of an invasion. The incident with the HMS Leda near the fortress of Santa Teresa was dismissed because he considered that a single ship wasn't evidence of an impending attack. Although many Spanish officers feared an imminent invasion, Sobremonte only sent a group of soldiers commanded by Santiago de Liniers to occupy Ensenada on June 24. A British recon that approached Ensenada was repelled by Liniers, who considered it a smuggler's attack. This news confirmed Sobremonte's belief that there was no danger. That night, he went to the theater to infuse confidence to the people. But by 9 p.m., during the play, the Viceroy was informed of the real magnitude of the attack. He abandoned the theater in a rush and went to the fort, where the alarm was raised. Buenos Aires didn't have troops that could face the British. Most of the regular troops were sent to Montevideo, and only the Blandengues, commanded by Colonel Nicolás de la Quintana, were professional forces. There were 4 militias to support the army: the voluntary cavalry, commanded by Colonel Juan Ignacio de Lía, the voluntary infantry, commanded by Miguel Ignacio de Azcuénaga, the invalid corps, formed by regular troops not fit for combat, and finally the urban corps, a group of armed merchants commanded by Colonel Juan Ignacio Alsina y Berejes. In theory, the militias could raise 4,000 men, but it was only possible to gather half that number. Most of the men were poorly equipped and had almost no training. The poor situation of the militias was the result of a calculated risk. The revolutionary ideas that were appearing at the time as the results of the events in the United States, France and Haiti were becoming popular in the city. The last thing the Viceroy wanted was to train and arm a population that was potentially hostile to his government. At the fort, a council of war was formed and the first orders were issued. Colonel Quintana will gather his Blandengues at the Galvez Bridge and advance to the reduction village. The officers of the voluntary cavalry would gather their men and would march to join Quintana the next morning. De Lía will stay at the Galvez Bridge as a reserve. 2 patrols were sent to the reduction village. The first, with 5 men, will signal the enemy approach with a cannon shot. The second, with 12 men, will patrol the surrounding marshes. The sunrise of June 25 showed the size of the threat when the British fleet became visible to the whole city. The British landing started at midday. The HMS Encounter, even with its slow draft, could only approach up to 1.5 kilometers to the coast, where it was grounded on purpose to cover the landing. A fleet of 21 boats took Beresford and his 1,600 soldiers half a kilometer from the coast. From there, they had to walk through the marshes and they formed a perimeter when they landed. At 5 p.m., Colonel Quintana of the Blandengues arrived to the vicinity of the British landing. An hour later, Pedro de Arce, Sub-Inspector General of the Army, assumed command of the operation with 600 men. The Spaniards were positioned on the high ground, while the British, 3 kilometers away, formed a defensive perimeter. By 8 p.m., the landing was completed and the HMS Encounter joined the Narcissus. By 7 a.m., the British started to prepare their move. Meanwhile, Arce sent a message to Colonel Delia from the voluntary cavalry. He had to abandon his position at the Galvez Bridge and join the rest of the troops at Quilmes. At the beginning, Arce was confident that the British attack wasn't strong enough and that it would be easy to defeat it. But with the passing hours, the information he received from his recon troops made him realize that he was fighting a large number of well-trained troops. By 9 a.m., the British deployment started. The troops formed two lines, with the Royal Marines, commanded by Captain William King, at left, and the 71st Highlander Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Dennis Pack, at the right. The column was flanked by cannons at both sides and howitzers at the center. Behind them marched the St. Helene troops with additional artillery to support the advance and cover the flanks. Arce formed a single line with Quintana's Blandengues on the right and the voluntary cavalry on the left, protecting its right flank with the reduction village. The marshes were a big problem for the British movements. Most of the cannons got stuck and they couldn't keep up with the infantry advance. The Spaniards opened fire on the 71st while Delia's cavalry arrived from the rear. To his frustration, he didn't receive an order to charge against the British. Instead, he was ordered to stay to the left of the line. Beresford, seeing the Spanish reinforcement arriving, ordered the infantry to charge the enemy line. The 71st shot several times against the Spanish and then advanced with fixed bayonet against Quintana. The Marines followed the action, covering the rear, while the St. Helene troops turned to the right to block the Spanish reinforcement. Two cannons at the left flank that managed to pass the marshes opened fire upon Quintana's position, breaking his line. Quintana's troops, in their retreat, mixed with Delia's, causing confusion. The Spaniards abandoned several cannons and started a retreat to Buenos Aires. Beresford gave his troops a couple of hours to rest, while Captain Ross Donnelly from the Narcissus pulled out the cannons from the marshes. Once the troops were rested and the cannons freed, the British restarted their advance until they occupied Juan Antonio de Santa Coloma's ranch. From there, they could see a big fire in the horizon. The Spaniards were burning the Galvez Bridge.